my work, I call it a rethinking of the history of the 19th century. The reason I'm calling it a rethinking of the history of the 19th century is because I came across a lecture that Walter Rodney gave at Binghamton University in 1978, in which he made a very, very important point. And he said, look, while historians and social analysts have done a tremendous job in talking about the history of the 19th century, that the basis of their understanding and the basis of their foundation of their analysis is skewed. And he said it is skewed from the basis that they established their analysis lock, stock, and barrel based on the point of view of the planter class. That the ex-slaves, after emancipation, abandoned the plantations en masse. He argued that that did not happen. And he said that the duty of new scholars is to go back into that history and rewrite it. Go back into that history and reanalyze it. So my thesis begins from that point, in which I discuss a number of positions that have been taken, both in relationship to what happened to the African population of Guyana, and that is, I mean, the people who have dealt with the history of Guyana, Alan Adamson, J. Mandel, Rolf Farley, and all these guys. I dealt with that, and secondly, I dealt with people like Eric Williams, Lowell Regatz, and scholars like that, who place Guyana economically, politically, and geographically in the context of what was happening in the West Indies. My thesis, therefore, begins by arguing that it is wrong to place Guyana in the context of the history of the West Indies of that period, because the West Indian colonies began its process of decline around 1815. The West Indian colonies were no longer required after 1815 to produce sugar for a world economy, because, as Eric Williams argued, economically, right, they were no longer sound to produce sugar economically to compete on the world market. My thesis therefore argues that, on the other hand, the sugar industry in Guyana began in that period and grew from that period. So if you were to look at sugar alone, Guyana was involved in the 19th century sugar revolution when the West Indies was not. From that standpoint, I argue that the marginalization of Africans in Guyana in slavery in the period 1815 to 1838 and after 1838 have to be understood from the standpoint of the growth of slavery outside the British Empire. The growth of slavery in Cuba, the growth of slavery in Brazil, the growth of slavery in the United States. That the growth of slavery in these places was related to the production of sugar, cotton, and coffee for the world market, within which Guyana's sugar was in competition. From that standpoint, I argue that the marginalization of African labor after emancipation have to be understood based on slavery in Cuba and Brazil. What Dale Tomich, my advisor, calls the second slavery in his writings. It is from that standpoint I argue that we have to understand why the African villages stagnated, as Adamson, Farley, and all the historians of Guyana talked about in their works but did not analyze. I argue that the stagnation of the African villages after 1850, everybody agrees that the African villages in Guyana did not rise, stopped growing, they stagnated after 1852. I argue that the reason for the stagnation was because labor in Guyana had to be cheapened in that period to match the competition from slave production in another part of the world economy. So I'm saying that what happened in Guyana and African marginalization have to be understood as a manifestation, as a local manifestation of global change within the world economy. It is in that context that I argue that we have to understand the importation of Portuguese and East Indian labor. Because Portuguese, I mean, you know, I went back yesterday and on Friday to reread a thesis that was done by a guy named Michael Wagner at McGill University in Toronto, in which he's talking about the introduction of the Portuguese. And both Walter Rodney and this guy is saying, look, the Portuguese were recruited to create a middle class, a buffer class between the European population and the black population. They were recruited to ensure that the black population, that a section of the black population did not become the middle class that was necessary in Guyana. Let us backtrack here. When we look at the history of Jamaica, right? What we see an African middle class developing even before slavery ended, right? So there was already a buffer class at the time slavery ended in certain places of the Caribbean, right? That was African. In Guyana, there was none of that. And then the Portuguese were recruited to undercut the opportunities of the black population to become a middle class. So by 1848, the Portuguese were owners of all the spirit shops, most of the Solgood shops. Walter Rodney speaks about this in the history of the Guyanese working people. So what happened? What is the contribution of the Portuguese to the defeat of the sugar strike of 1848? When the African workers took strike action in 1848, remember the strike in 1848 was based on the imposition of the planter class. They wanted to reduce wages, right? And to bring wages down to where wages were at the moment when apprenticeship began in 1833. And the ex-slaves took strike action. In the midst of that strike, if people are on strike, they need sustenance. With the disappearance of the Africans from the retail trade, the Portuguese shops refused to give the African population any credit, any food on credit. That contributed significantly in the breaking of the 1848 strike. It was in 1848, we have to remember, while indentured labor was being brought in since 1835, in 1848 was the first year in which the indentured penal contract was established. The indentured penal contract was established, right, as a consequence of the need for labor in Guyana to be made pliable and cheap so that Guyanese sugar could compete with Cuban sugar on the world market because of the Sugar Duties Act, which was passed in 1846, which equalized the duties on sugar, on slave-produced and free-produced sugar on the world market. And it's in the context of that that the penal arrangement that bound East Indian labor to the plantations were established after 1848. So what I'm saying is that we have to understand African marginalization in the villages, the encirclement of the villages, from the standpoint of the penal contract, not from the standpoint of indentureship. Because indentureship was bad. From the standpoint of the penal contract, which tied East Indian labor to the plantations. I mean, and how did that happen? An East Indian laborer, between 1848 and the time indentureship came to an end, could not wander about the country. For them to go from one plantation, they could not go from one plantation to another to seek employment. They were tied to the plantations. If they had to move to another place, they had to get permission. In South Africa, they had passed laws right? In Guyana, they did not call it pass laws. They had to get a special permission, a note from the estate manager. Walter, in his book, said that this penal contract was as such that if an East Indian indentured laborer was not at work, they were deemed to be in hospital or in jail, because they had to be at work, because the contract ensured that they had to be at work. So we have to understand how marginalization takes place. There's another point that I make in my thesis that is related to that. I'm saying that because of the land laws that were passed to fragment the African villages, and Clementi in his Constitutional History of British Guyana, I have a quotation he said something in his book which he did not clarify. And he said, look, the villages were imposed on plantation space. And he did not go further to explain what he meant, right? But plantation space was developed to ensure that drainage and irrigation was centralized. Each plantation was like a country on its own. The village of Plaisance, which was a plantation, or the village of Better Hope, which was a plantation, these were separate countries. They were in charge of their own operations. The point I make in my dissertation is that the superimposition of village on that layout, right, contributed to the problems that the African villages have to this day. When you tie that to the indentured contract and what the indentured contract did to whether African labor could have gained employment on plantations between 1850 and 1890, right? You see a different story. What is the story that we see? African labor in that period was only able to gain employment on the plantations, on the sugar plantations, when a plantation did not have its full complement of indentured workers. So African labor, which were kept in these villages where they had little small portions of land, in which, in a report by the Attorney General to Governor Hicks in 1862, he says, look, I don't understand how these people in Buxton, in BV, in Plaisance and different villages are living, because these villages for most of the year are like sheets of stagnant water. So the villages, they could not earn, so they could not plant, most of them could not plant subsistence crops in the villages, and most of them could not get work on the plantations. So in that kind of situation, what happened? Some estates were renting out land to Africans at very high rents so that they can plant plantain and ground provisions in order to subsist in the villages. So estates were doing that, right? And by the 1880s, a discussion began among the African population. They were debating among themselves, what are we doing? Perhaps we should go and ask estate man at the planter class for indenture. Let us be indentured so that we can get work. Because the point I'm making here is that the combination of the penal contract and the laws that were put in place to encircle the African villages combined to create the African workforce into what Karl Marx in capital called the development of a reserve army of labor. The African workers, the African people in Guyana was constructed in that period after the defeat of the 1848 strike, right? And until the mid-1880s into a reserve army of labor. The last point I want to make on that is that this view, and Walter makes this point in some of his writings, that the African villages constituted what is called a peasantry does not hold up. I mean, if you were to really analyze it, it does not hold water. Because number one, they did not have enough land. I mean, the parcels that they had were minuscule parcels. A quarter acre here, a dam bed here, a little piece there, right? So they could not develop. I mean, let's back up. Even under slavery, the slaves in Jamaica were already producing crops in their provision grounds, which were being exported. Under slavery, the slaves were already engaged in the export market. In Guyana, the African population were never able to produce a crop to engage in money-making ventures on the export market. The first time any group of the population outside of the planter class was able to develop a crop and engage in exports was the East Indian population, with the development of rice exportation, which began in 1908. The African population, therefore, was completely marginalized in the quest of the planter class to have a cheap and available labor force available to them. They had to create the African workforce into a reserve army of labor in order to keep Indian labor cheap. It's, and so, I am not, you can't, what I'm doing is not casting blame on Indian labor. Both East Indian labor and African labor became captive labor in that process. And so what we see, and this point I don't make in my dissertation, but what we can, from that history, we can deduce the racial problems of today. If we were to understand the history of the 19th century, we could deduce the racial problems of today. And so in order to deal with the future, in order to deal with the problems of race, we have to go back to the history of the 19th century. And we have to base programs and policies that addresses the disparities that history brought to bear in the structure of the society. This was brought out in January last year. I got together a couple East Indian youth in the village of my birth, Cladystain. And I said, look, I want to talk to you about the African village next door. And I said, look, when you look at the African village, what first comes to your mind? And they said, we see lazy people. Now, in looking at the reports of the stipendiary magistrates of the 1840s, the reports of the stipendiary magistrates between 1842 and 1848 is talking about how, in glowing terms, about the growth and development of the African villages, how the people are progressive, how they have beautiful homes, how they have farms, they have gardens, they have all these things. And after 1848, the reports of the stipendiary magistrates are talking about how this group of people, who by 1848 are progressive, are now lazy, have gone beyond the pale of civilization. How does a section of the population move from being progressive, to outside the pale of civilization? So the concept that the African population is lazy developed from the colonial mindset. Because when you look at the colonial literature that develops after 1848 is talking about how the African population is lazy. Before 1848, Governor Light, in all his pronouncements, are talking about the progress in the African villages. And after 1848, Governor Barclay and all the other succeeding governors are talking about how the African population have gone into the pale beyond civilization and they're now lazy. Right? So, I mean, I give you that anecdote. So I continued the conversation with these Indian youth. And I said, well, that is an interesting term. I want you to tell me, when you were growing up as a child, what did you see in the African village? And they said, look, what did we see? We saw these African people digging their trenches and their drains with shovels by hand. We saw them planting these lands and said, well, flip over to your parents now, because only a dam divided two villages. Like every dam divides an African and an Indian village in Guyana. What did you see what your parents was doing? Said we were planting rice. I said, what else? Said we were employing drag lines and machinery to dig our trenches. We were using tractors in our rice fields. Right? I said, well, let us fast forward to the future. When you look at the African village today, you said that it's now in bush. Right? Let's talk about what you're doing now, because you have inherited land from your parents. One of them said that he inherited 40 acres from his parents. And I said, so what are you doing for a living? And he said, I am driving a truck. I said, well, you have 40 acres of land and you're driving a truck. Why are you driving a truck? He said, because in the conditions of the economy, it can no longer pay for a person to make a living from 40 acres of land. That you can no longer make a living from 40 acres of land as an individual. And I said, well, how much land do you think each African person have in the villages? And he said, well, they have a dam bed here and a little piece there. And I said to him, well, if you cannot make a living from 40 acres of land, do you think an average African person in a village can make a living from a quarter acre of land? And you know what the Indian youth turned and told me? He said, it is the first time that anybody have had a conversation with me without talking about race that allows me to see race. He said from that conversation, from that interview, he was able to see how this disparity developed. Now, that is what I want to do. The importance is that we have to recapture that history. But it's not mobilized, it's mobilizable. But it has remained immobilized over the past 150 years. I mean, succeeding governments have done nothing to mobilize the capacity of the villages. They have mobilized the capacity of the villages for political action, not for action in their own defense. The answer, that was the difference between Walter and these guys, is that Walter wanted to mobilize the villages for economic action in their own defense. He did not want to mobilize the villages for political action, to use them in order to gain political power. That's the difference. Guyana is a political place where people uses the political parties, use the masses to create the space of political power, right? But they don't give back anything to the villages and to the populations, either East Indians or Africans. Because we can talk about the condition of the African villages. And we can also talk about the condition of the Indian villages. Because there is, in a lot of these villages, there are no real big differences between the bad conditions of the Indian villages and the bad conditions of the African villages. The conditions in these two types of villages are equally stark. You know, let's look at Port Morant, where Dr. Jagan came from. You know, it's a paradox that he came from that village, right? And I mean, just go among the people. I mean, as an activist, I have lived in Cane Cotter's houses in Port Morant. And I've seen cane cutters operate like the African workers in the 1850s, where the wives of cane cutters were sending their children to the shop to buy a quarter pint of cooking oil, a flag of garlic, one onion, in order to cook one meal. This is what the African population, who did not have money in the 1850s because they could not gain enough employment, right, was doing. And the Portuguese shops in the 1850s refused to sell them provisions in small quantities, which was one of the reasons for the riots against the Portuguese in the 1850s. And this is happening now in the sugar communities. So if we look deeply, and we need to do this research, a lot of research is not being done. We need to look at the deeper meanings of life in these two types of villages, because there are similarities in relationship to their conditions. Sometimes my dissertation looks at the African condition, and I was because of what happened in the 19th century, right? But the African condition, the conditions of some of the African villages, I know that I'm going out on a limb here, right, is no different than the conditions in a lot of the East Indian villages. And we have to be able to do this work. And that's the challenge to young students. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. I'm saying that these are questions that we have to explore. And I'm willing to explore these questions, right? Because, look, my work is not political. My work is social. It's sociological. It is, for me, I see it as a resource to inform policy, to inform people who want to make change. And that's the point I'm making. I make the point that if you want to make change, you have to go back to history. And you have to make change based on an understanding of history.